Are we making life too easy for our brains? This is what taxi drivers may be teaching us about Alzheimer's disease. Hello, friends, and welcome to Senior to Seniors, where real life experience meets real world guidance for the second half of life. I'm Jim Mazziotti, a senior myself, and today I want to talk with you about something I came across that stopped me in my tracks. It involves Alzheimer's disease. It involves nearly 9 million Americans, and strangely enough, it involves taxi drivers. Yes, taxi drivers, because researchers discovered something that at first almost sounds too unusual to be true. When they examined hundreds of different occupations, taxi drivers, along with ambulance drivers, had the lowest percentages of deaths attributed to Alzheimer's disease after researchers adjusted for several demographic factors. So naturally, I wanted to know why. And more importantly, for those of us getting older, could there be something we can learn from taxi drivers? This is a study that caught my attention. The research was published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, one of the world's most respected medical journals. Research examined U.S. death certificate data from 2020 through 2022. We're not talking about a few thousand people. They studied occupational information connected with 8,972,000 deaths. They looked at 443 different occupational groups. Of those nearly 9 million deaths, about 348,000, 3.88%, had Alzheimer's disease listed as the underlying cause of death. Then researchers began looking at occupations, and that's where things became fascinating. Among taxi drivers, Alzheimer's accounted for just 1% of deaths. Among ambulance drivers, it was less than 1% before adjustment. After researchers adjusted for factors including age at death, sex, race, ethnicity, and education, taxi drivers and ambulance drivers still had the two lowest percentages of deaths attributed to Alzheimer's among 443 occupations. Think about it. Not 42, not 17, the two lowest. And researchers wanted to understand what might make these particular occupations different. One possibility caught their attention: navigation. So what does driving have to do with your brain? Well, think about what an old school taxi driver had to do every single day. Someone gets into the cab and says, take me to this address. Now, the driver's brain goes to work. Where am I? Where is the passenger going? What's the best route? Which streets connect? Is there construction? Can I take an alternative road? Where do I turn? What landmarks am I looking for this trip? And if something changes along the way, what do I do now? The driver isn't simply remembering information. The driver is continually processing, navigating, adapting, and solving problems. And ambulance driver faces an even more demanding version of the same challenge. And there's a part of our brain heavily involved in these abilities. It's called the hippocampus. The hippocampus plays an important role in memory and spatial navigation. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. The hippocampus is also one of the brain regions affected by Alzheimer's disease. Previous research involved London taxi drivers found structural differences in hippocampus associated with their extensive navigational demands. That earlier research helped inspire the researchers behind this American study, and it led them to ask a fascinating question. Could occupations requiring constant spatial navigation somehow be associated with lower Alzheimer's mortality? Notice the words I'm using: could be associated, not causes, not prevents, not proves, Well, come back to that because it's extremely important. Then the study gets even more interesting. You may be thinking, Jim, it's just driving. But the researchers thought of that too. So they looked at other transportation occupations. They examined bus drivers, aircraft pilots, ship captains, and they did not see the same pattern. What might that matter? Why might that matter? Because those occupations can involve more predetermined routes and therefore potentially fewer of the unpredictable real-time navigational decisions researchers were interested in studying. For example, after adjustment, bus drivers were nowhere near the bottom of Alzheimer's mortality, and aircraft pilots actually ranked near the opposite end, fourth highest among the 443 occupations studied. So maybe the interesting part isn't simply transportation. Maybe it isn't even driving. Maybe the question is, how much are you making your brain figure things out? And that got me thinking about us, you and me. I host this program called Senior to Seniors for a reason. I'm not talking to you as a 30-year-old telling older adults how they should live. I'm living this stage of life right alongside of you. And one of the great benefits of getting older is experience. We've solved a lot of problems in our lives. We've learned a lot of lessons. We know how to do a lot of things because we had to do a lot of things. But there may also be a downside. We can become very good at making life easy. We know the familiar roads. We develop routines. We eat at the same restaurants. We shop at the same stores. We watch the same television programs. We spend time with the same people. We do the things we're comfortable doing. And technology can make it even easier. Think about GPS. Years ago, if I wanted to go somewhere unfamiliar, I might look at a map. I might pull out my old atlas. I'd figure out which highway I needed. I'd remember an exit. I'd look for a landmark. I'd make a wrong turn and have to figure out how to get myself back on track. Do you remember those days? Today, I type in an address and a voice tells me, turn right in 500 feet. Then turn left. Then you have arrived. Convenient? Absolutely. I love it too. But here's the question this study made me consider. How many little thinking jobs have we gradually outsourced? Not just navigation. Our phones remember telephone numbers. Calendars remind us about appointments. Search engines retrieve information instantly. Calculators do our arithmetic. Apps recommend what we should watch. Technology can even write and think alongside of us. And none of that is necessarily bad, but perhaps there's another question worth asking. What are we still asking our brains to do? Now, don't throw away your GPS. Before anybody turns off this podcast and decides Jim Mazziotti told everybody over 65 to throw away their GPS, I don't and I didn't. Please keep your GPS. And if you don't know where you're going, by all means, use it. Safety, of course, comes first. And I certainly don't want anyone intentionally getting lost because they heard something on Senior to Seniors. The bigger point isn't GPS. The point is challenge. Are there safe, enjoyable ways we can continue asking our brains to learn, remember, adapt, and solve problems? Maybe you occasionally try to remember the route before turning on navigation. Maybe you learn a new card game. Maybe you do puzzles. Maybe you learn another language. Perhaps you learn to play an instrument. Maybe you finally pick up your guitar. Maybe you learn new songs. Maybe you take a class at the community college. Maybe you travel somewhere unfamiliar and learn your surroundings. And maybe you cook something you have never cooked before. Perhaps you learn a piece of technology instead of immediately handing the phone to your son, your daughter, your grandson or granddaughter and saying, "Here, can you figure this thing out for me?" Maybe it's simply doing something unfamiliar enough that your brain has to say, "Wait a minute, I have to figure this out." That's the idea that interests me. But here's the most important part. I want to be very responsible about what this research actually tells us. This study does not prove that navigating prevents Alzheimer's disease. The researchers themselves are very clear about that. This was an observational study. There could be other explanations for what they found. For example, perhaps people who naturally have particularly strong spatial abilities are more likely to become or remain taxi and ambulance drivers. There could also be biological, social, or occupational factors that researchers couldn't completely account for. Death certificates can also underestimate Alzheimer's disease. And the study examined the proportion of deaths attributed to Alzheimer's, not whether a certain occupation guarantees a lower lifetime probability of developing the disease. The researchers themselves describe these results as essentially a starting point for other things. In other words, interesting, absolutely, important, potentially. Proof that navigation prevents Alzheimer's? No. And that's a distinction we need to respect. But maybe there's a bigger lesson here. Here's what I'm coming back to. Aging doesn't have to mean disengaging. It doesn't have to mean I've learned enough. I've experienced enough. I've challenged myself enough. I've done enough. Maybe one of the most important words in aging is next. N-E-X-T. What can we learn next? Where can I go next? Who can I meet next? What can I attempt next? What problem can I solve next? What skill can I develop next? What can I become interested in next? Because curiosity doesn't have an expiration date. Learning doesn't have an expiration date, and purpose certainly doesn't have an expiration date. Maybe retirement shouldn't mean retiring our brains. So here's my challenge to you today. Sometime this week, do one thing that makes your brain work a little harder. Nothing dangerous, nothing overwhelming, just different. Drive a safe but unfamiliar route and pay attention to the landmarks. Look around. Learn 5 chords on your guitar. Try memorizing a short poem. Try a crossword puzzle. Learn 10 words in another language. Take a class. Learn how to use a new piece of technology. Read about something you've never understood. Call somebody and have a conversation about something that challenges the way you think. Put yourself in a situation where you have to learn, where you have to think, and don't become frustrated when it's difficult. The difficulty may be the point. We spend much of our lives becoming efficient. Maybe occasionally we need to become beginners again. There's humility in becoming a beginner. There's curiosity in becoming a beginner, and there's challenge in becoming a beginner. And there's something wonderfully alive about saying, I don't know how to do this yet, but I'm going to learn. I am going to try to learn. My final thought today. So, what can taxi drivers teach us about Alzheimer's disease? Well, we really don't know yet. And scientifically, that's the responsible answer. But this research involving nearly 9 million deaths gives scientists an intriguing question to investigate. Could frequent spatial navigation and real-time cognitive processing somehow be associated with lower Alzheimer's mortality? Researchers say more work is needed before anyone can answer that definitely. But maybe there's already a worthwhile question the rest of us can ask ourselves. Am I continuing to challenge my brain, or am I making everything so comfortable that I rarely ask it to do something? We cannot control everything about aging. We cannot guarantee that any particular activity will prevent Alzheimer's disease, but we can remain curious. We can keep learning. We can keep exploring. We can keep solving problems. And we can keep engaging with people, even challenging ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, we can keep giving ourselves something new to look forward to. I'm Jim Mazziotti. Thank you so much for joining me today on my Senior to Seniors podcast, where real life experience meets real world guidance for the second half of life. Oh, and here's your challenge. Before the week is over, go learn something you don't already know. Your brain just might appreciate the workout. I'll see you next time. If you found any value in today's podcast, please share it with a friend, subscribe to the podcast, like the podcast, and I want to thank you for being here today. Have a great day.